All right, welcome back, Morning Buzz crew. I am your co-host JT Bethea, and we have a very special interview today. We have with us Dr. Leslie Wilson, expert on environmental racism in New York City, community development, American history, and African American studies. Thank you so much for joining us today here on the Buzz, Mr. Wilson, Dr. Wilson.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning to you. We have some questions here for you, so let's get started. So,
Okay.
first question: how has the curriculum of Black history changed over the years?
Oh my gosh, that's such an easy question. Thank you. Um, the curriculum of Black history has changed because the world's changed. But when Black history started back in the day, in the beginning of the 20th century, it was basically following a pattern of trying to introduce ideas and trying to say that African Americans have done something. We came to America. That at that point, it was largely trying to tell the story of we came to America mostly as slaves. We were enslaved people. We've gained our freedom, and we have contributed to America. By the mid 1950s, that narrative had changed. People had started to do a lot of research and had found out about the world before enslavement, the world in Africa. And so now there was a history of what Africans had done. And that history now was very different. And so that history said, we had a great past. Yes, there were people who were enslaved and brought to America, but now they've gained their freedom and it's a completely different story. And so the story shifted to one that said, okay, we can take this story and we can put it into the American narrative and it will look like everyone else's story. And so John Hope Franklin's From Slavery to Freedom became sort of that way of saying that the story of African Americans was just like the story of every other group. It was a immigrant story, people coming to America and being transformed. Now, a lot of people at first said, oh, this story is a little weird because people were enslaved. But the idea was that there was a story of progress. Just like every other immigrant group, there was a story of progress. By the end of the 20th century, the story had changed to say there were two different paths. There was this path of the great African past, and then there was a story of trial and controversy and a story of progress within America. And I think that's the path that we're basically teaching now. We talk about the great African past, we talk about the trials and tribulations of enslavement, we talk about the trials and tribulations that have accompanied emancipation, and then we have talked about the achievements that have come since emancipation.
Got you. How about with Black History Month? How do we teach that in schools and promote equality while also celebrating the success of Black people?
Okay, so that's getting a little difficult right now with all these bills being passed in the various states. So K to 12 education is now shifting from the way that Black History Month is being taught on college campuses. So it depends now where you live in the United States, how we're teaching about Black History Month or African American History Month, um, the way in which you see it. So the the states that are passing these bills are basically saying that you can't teach anything that offends uh, an audience, which is basically a white audience. And that's where the controversy is. Because how do you teach something that offends one group but doesn't offend another group, right? And
Mhm.
how do you talk about the history of enslavement and then the history of Jim Crow without saying that it shouldn't offend Black people? Because that's almost impossible, right? You
Mhm.
were enslaved, you were supposedly given your freedom, but yet there was still discrimination against you. So this is very hard to talk about that. So what's seemingly happening now is that you can only talk about great triumphs and put those triumphs in the story of the national narrative of America. But what I think is happening in New Jersey, which is radically different, is that we have the Amistad laws. And the Amistad laws say that you have to teach African American history within the curriculum of the United States. And so, using the Amistad laws, you can still teach African American history within American history, and you can show these contesting moments. And I think that that's the way that you should teach it.
Definitely. All right. Well, having Black History Month is without a doubt 100% important. Some may argue that devoting an entire month out of the year isn't enough. Some may argue that we shouldn't just care in February, but we should care all around the year. What are your thoughts on this argument? I can probably already can tell most of what you're gonna say.
Yes, you can tell what I'm going to say. We should teach African American history all year long. And I think that's why in New Jersey we support the Samastad law, because we should do this. We should just incorporate African American history into American history. It is American history. And if you teach it that way, you'll teach it all year long. There won't be a moment where you won't teach African American history.
I say like you're right. Black history is American history. America isn't America without us, without our
Mhm.
ancestry. And you're right. Too devoted to just a month doesn't seem fair. Almost kind of seems performative in several ways. So yeah, you're right. We should just implement it 100% throughout the career instead of just spending a couple months of February talking about Dr. King and Miss Parks and leaving it at that. Just a few months ago, Black Lives Matter was nowhere near as well known as it is now. What do you say has changed to make it so prominent?
Uh, Clearly, the George Floyd moment has changed everything. Um, the tragic death of George Floyd, the tragic death of Breonna Taylor coming so close together, and then tied with COVID and the death of so many Black and Brown people in the United States is an awakening. Um, and it's not going away. I think that that is the most pivotal moment in this century for America to wake up and recognize that there are inequities in this society. And those moments have transformed us in so many ways so that Black Lives Matter cannot be ignored. It put millions of people in the streets, and it showed that there is a unity amongst people in this country that people didn't think of before. So it was a transformative moment, but it's also an ongoing struggle. And the fact that it happened in the middle of a pandemic is really critical.
Mm.
That despite the fact that you could be sick, you could get killed, you could die, people were still out in the streets protesting for the rights of African Americans. They were still out in the streets protesting for justice. And I think that this is the social justice era. It's also important that this was happening during, as you were talking about a few minutes ago, one of the worst presidencies in American history. And the fact that people recognize that the presidency was being turned into a racist instrument is very critical. And so, how could you not see this and how could you not protest against it? And so, people who would have never protested before suddenly came out and said, I agree, all lives have to matter. I have to be out there, regardless of the views that I might have had 5 minutes ago or 10 years ago. And they were out in the streets protesting.
Mhm. That is great. We bring up the things like George Floyd because what I'm noticing is each tragedy throws more issue into the public eye. So, how would you say events like this help popularize the movements for Black activism?
So I think that there were two things going on. Um, there is a whittling away of the strength that people have, um, and the resistance that people have. That for a lot of people, there was a reluctancy to challenge the status quo. And there was sort of like, I'm going to sit on the couch. I don't want to be involved. But when you start to see over and over again, thanks to our phones, these incidents, you sort of become weakened by it. The resolve changes and people are moved to action. And so I think that that's where the strength comes from, to say, I can't live like this. I can't survive in this moment, right? And I have to come out and I have to do something. And so I think that that's going to lead to change. It may not be the change that we want, but it's going to be the change that we probably need. And so there are different generations of change. And what I think that we're witnessing as a historian right now are different generations of change. So my generation is changing differently than your generation. And your generation is like more fed up than my generation is, right? So my generation is like, okay, I'm getting off the couch. I'm going to go outside and protest. But my anger might be restrained. Your generation is like, I'm sick of this mess. I got to get out, right? And you're going out and you're doing things that are not what I would say you should do, but you're expressing your anger and your frustration. And I think that that's why we're witnessing degrees of change in this country, because those generations of change are culminating into something which is going to lead to that moment that's going to transform America completely.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that you point out the differences in generation because we have um, we have the fact that events like George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery were propelled because of this generation's tendency to video everything. Everything's on tape now. We've seen all of these events are being thrust into public eye, and there's videos released of the entire situation folding out. So, how would you feel the rise in technology has affected activism as a whole?
I think technology has transformed activism. Without the technology, we would be 30 years behind, right? So if we had the same technology that we have now in the 1960s, the 1960s would have been completely different, right? Um, I mean, the 1960s was propelled by television, but the civil rights leaders used television to gain sympathy, right? So they marched, and television helped them because it showed the violence in southern cities of southern police officers beating protesters. Now, the video camera on your phone is not showing organized violence, right? It's showing isolated violence. And so it's not the cops, having a meeting beforehand saying, when these guys come out, let's beat the crap out of them. These are just isolated cops saying, okay, we can beat the crap out of them and we don't care, right? And so it's showing that there is a different type of racism. This is not like planned racism. This is systemic racism. And one of the things that has been revealed by this is how deep racism is in this country. So even an event like what happened the other day at the mall in Bridgewater, right, when the black guy and the white guy were fighting in the mall, that was videotaped. And it shows how systemic racism operates. Two guys are fighting, black guy and a white guy. The cops come and they jump on the black guy, and everyone can see it. The white guy is sitting on the couch. Now, that's systemic, right? The
Especially when you look
question
at the
is
video
exactly, especially when you look at the video.
and see that the white one was on top, clearly visible.
Yes, right. And we would have never had that before. That would have been something that someone would have had to say, oh, well, I heard that this happened, but you would have never seen it, right? Because news cameras wouldn't have been there. So this wouldn't have been a 1960s minute. But now we have this all the time. And so you can see systemic racism. And again, in the idea of generations, an older generation can now say, okay, yes, I know there's always been systemic racism, but I can't take it anymore because I can see it every day. A younger generation is like, well, we're supposed to be beyond this. And here it is. We're always filming systemic racism. We have to change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's amazing. Like you said, it's like even with the technology, we still have a lot of people trying to defend it, saying it's like we don't know what happened before, we don't know what happened after, we don't know why. There's more to the story, and it's great that you mentioned Bridgewater. I don't know if you were in the waiting room when we were talking about it, but we just were. Um, so how would you say that affects the progress inequality, or would you say we're even getting anywhere?
I think there's always progress, right? And I don't want to be the Debbie Downer and say no, there's no progress. There's always progress. It's the question of how fast is progress occurring, right? So that the progress is the governor made a statement. The governor says we have to wait and we have to see what the investigation leads to. That's progress, right? Because 50 years ago, the governor wouldn't have made a comment at all, right? So there is progress in the sense that we are getting quick responses. The responses are not always the ones that we want or the ones that we want to hear, but there is progress.
All right. Back in early June, Governor Kim Reynolds signed a bill that restricts what teachers can teach in kindergarten through 12th grade schools, along with public universities. Specifically, how do these laws and critical race theories, CRT, make teaching harder in education?
Okay, I just have to make one comment. Critical race theory is not what these people are talking about. This is
Definitely.
a buzzword, right?
Hmm.
And so critical race theory is something completely different than what these, particularly Republican politicians, are talking about. Critical race theory is an argument about the ways in which the laws of the United States operate and the ways in which the laws of the United States have been used to favor wealthy people and to favor white people. That's what critical race theory was. And it's a legal theory developed by legal scholars. It is not taught in elementary schools. It is not taught in high schools. It is hardly taught in college. It is basically a legal theory that is explained and taught in some law schools. What these people are talking about in various states is basically history. And they are afraid uh, of the way that history could be taught or the way that history is taught, but it's largely a reaction to things like the 1619 Project, where the 1619 Project tried to place enslavement at the center of American history before the Civil War. And so the fear that they are talking about is not really the fear that they are expressing publicly. The fear that they are talking about is the fear of what I would call a Black planet. Okay. It's a fear that by 2035, 2050, the majority of the United States will be people of color, particularly Latinx people. And the fear is that the power structure of the United States will shift from the hands of whites to people of color. And they are so afraid that when this happens, there will be some type of racial uproar, almost sort of like a Planet of the Apes type of situation, where white people will be attacked for all the evil that they've done, which is almost a ludicrous idea. And so, to minimize this, they do not want young white kids to be told anything about the past because they feel that young white kids might concede power and that young Black, brown, and Asian kids might learn something which would make them angry enough to attack white people in the future. It's almost like a comic book story, right? I'm afraid of what will happen in the future. I've gone to the future and I can see these race riots occurring and I'm going to lose. So I'm going to go back to the past and try to stop the future from happening. And this is like the attempt to stop the future from happening. So I'm going to wipe out anything that can make this future from happening. And that's what this is all about. It's going to protect the ideas of our harmonious society so that when this moment occurs, white people will be safe and white people will still maintain power. There is nothing to suggest that when the population of the United States is majority minority, that white people in America will lose political, social, or economic power. But just in case, we need to suppress the way that we teach history because we are afraid of some type of racial upheaval. And so that's what this is all about. But we can't say that publicly. So we need to pass laws to stop the teaching of the way that we would teach something so white kids won't feel bad. But we want everyone else to feel bad instead. So I don't want to teach about the ways that, Japanese Americans were uprooted from their homes during World War II and put into these internment camps, which basically are like concentration camps. I don't want Native American kids to learn that they have been put on reservations and kept on reservations since the 1800s. I don't want African Americans to learn that they've lost their rights. I don't want, Latinx people to learn that they have lost their rights and they have been discriminated against since the 1700s. I don't want anyone to know that. So that's what this is all about.
Mhm. To the rest of you guys, do you guys have any thoughts, any additions? I know this is mainly between me and Dr. Leslie, but Dr. Wilson, sorry.
That's fine. No.
But it's definitely interesting. Like it's definitely important for us to get everybody's inputs. Like, what do you guys feel like you guys are learning? Any questions for Wilson or even me?
Personally, I can't really say much on this topic, but I do agree with absolutely everything you're saying. And I think this is an important topic that we need to talk about. And I'm glad that we could have you on today and bring you on a platform that you can speak about this because more people need to hear this. So I just wanted to thank you personally.
Thank you.
That
Laura.
was very moving and just amazing. So thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
Of course.
It's a pleasure.
All right. Yeah. All right. We will be taking a very short break. Thank you again, Dr. Wilson. It was a pleasure. We'll be right back.
Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you. Thank you, JT.